It was just a photo of two children, but look closely at the doll between them. Rachel Morrison carefully unwrapped the package that had arrived at the Atlanta History Museum that morning. Inside, protected by layers of acid-free tissue paper, was a single photograph in a simple wooden frame. The accompanying note, typed on plain paper, was brief. Found hidden in my grandmother's attic. Never knew this existed. Thought you should have it. Please investigate. No return address. No name. Just the photograph and the cryptic message. Rachel studied the image under her desk lamp. It showed two young girls, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sitting together on what appeared to be a garden bench surrounded by flowering bushes. Both wore simple summer dresses typical of the 1890s. One girl was white with light hair pulled back in a ribbon. The other was black with her hair braided neatly. They sat close together, not touching, but comfortable in their proximity, both with their hands reaching toward a porcelain doll positioned carefully between them. What struck Rachel immediately was the unusual intimacy of the composition. In the segregated South of the 1890s, such a photograph would have been socially unacceptable, even dangerous to create. White children and black children simply didn't pose together as equals in formal photographs from that era. She turned the frame over and carefully removed the backing. On the reverse of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written, E&S, Summer 1895, The Garden. No last names. No location details, just initials and a date. Rachel grabbed her magnifying glass and examined the image more closely. The photograph was in remarkably good condition for its age, suggesting it had been carefully stored, probably in darkness. The girls' faces showed clearly, both looking directly at the camera with serious expressions typical of long exposure times. But it was the doll that caught Rachel's attention as she increased magnification. The porcelain doll appeared expensive, the kind wealthy families would buy for their daughters. It wore an elaborate lace dress, but something about its face looked odd. Rachel squinted, adjusting the angle of her lamp. Was she seeing this correctly? She needed better equipment. She carried the photograph to the museum's conservation lab, where they had digital microscopy tools for examining artifacts in extreme detail. Her colleague James was working late, hunched over a Civil War era sword. James, can I use the digital scope? I need to examine something. He looked up, curious. Sure, what have you got? I'm not entirely sure yet, Rachel replied, positioning the photograph under the high-powered digital microscope connected to a large monitor. She focused on the doll's face and slowly increased magnification. As the image enlarged on screen, both she and James leaned forward simultaneously. Is that James started? I think so, Rachel whispered. The doll's porcelain face was painted in two distinct halves. The left side was the typical pale white of Victorian dolls, but the right side had been carefully painted brown, not damage or deterioration, but deliberate modification. Someone had transformed this doll to have a face divided perfectly down the middle, half white, half black. I've never seen anything like this, James said quietly. That's intentional, right? Not some kind of manufacturing defect? Definitely intentional, Rachel confirmed, her heart racing. Look at the precision of the paint line. Someone modified this doll very carefully. And these two girls ... she gestured at the photograph, are sharing it. One white, one black, with a doll that represents both of them. Rachel spent the next 3 days obsessed with the photograph. She'd made high-resolution scans and had them printed large-scale, allowing her to study every detail. The garden setting, the girls' clothing, the mysterious doll. Each element offered clues about who these children were, and why their photograph had been hidden for over a century. She showed the image to Dr. Patricia Washington, the museum's director and an expert on African American history in the South. Patricia studied it in silence for several minutes, her expression growing more moved as she absorbed what she was seeing. Rachel, do you understand how extraordinary this is? Patricia finally said. 1895 Atlanta. Jim Crow laws were being aggressively enforced. Segregation was becoming more rigid, not less. Black and white children playing together would have been seen as threatening to the entire social order. And someone photographed them sharing a doll that was modified to represent both races. She shook her head in wonder. This is an act of radical love and defiance. I need to find out who they were, Rachel said. The initials are E and S, I'm guessing Emma and Sarah, or Elizabeth and Susan, or... The combinations are endless, but someone cared enough to take this photograph and preserve it, even if they had to hide it. Patricia nodded. Start with Atlanta city directories and census records from 1890 to 1900. Look for white families with daughters named E something, living near black families with daughters named S something. The garden suggests a residential neighborhood where their yards might have connected. Also check church records. Sometimes they documented children's activities. Rachel dove into research. Atlanta in 1895 was a city still recovering from the Civil War while simultaneously entrenching racial segregation. The photograph represented something that shouldn't have existed, a friendship that crossed the color line society was working so hard to maintain. She found dozens of Emmas and Elizabeths in white families and numerous Sarahs and Susans in black families. But connecting specific families who lived near each other was proving difficult. Property records from that era were incomplete, and many black families' addresses were poorly documented. Then Rachel remembered the garden. She examined the photograph again, focusing on the background vegetation. The flowering bushes looked like camellias, which bloomed in late winter and early spring in Atlanta. And behind the girls, partially visible, was what appeared to be a brick wall with distinctive decorative ironwork. She reached out to Dr. Henry Palmer, a retired professor of architecture at Georgia Tech, who specialized in historic Atlanta gardens and estates. When she emailed him the photograph, he called her within an hour. "That ironwork," he said excitedly, "is from the Wellington estate. I'd recognize that pattern anywhere." It was a distinctive design used only on properties designed by architect James Burton in the 1880s. There were only about 15 homes in Atlanta with that ironwork, all in the Inman Park area. Rachel felt a surge of hope. Inman Park in the 1890s had been one of Atlanta's first planned suburbs, with large homes on spacious lots. If she could narrow down which Wellington estate this was, she could identify the families who lived there. Armed with Dr. Palmer's information, Rachel focused her research on Inman Park properties with Burton ironwork from the 1890s. She spent hours in the Atlanta History Center's archives, poring over property records, old photographs of the neighborhood, and maps showing lot divisions. She found it in a property survey map from 1894, the Wellington estate at 247 Elizabeth Street, owned by Charles and Margaret Wellington. The property featured the distinctive Burton ironwork and extensive gardens. City directory listings showed Charles Wellington was a prosperous cotton merchant with 2 daughters. Rachel's hands trembled as she pulled up the 1890 census. There, Charles Wellington, age 42, Margaret Wellington, age 38, daughters Emma Wellington, age 5, and Carolyn Wellington, age 3. Emma would have been about 10 by 1895, the right age for the girl in the photograph. Now she needed to find the black family. In 1895, it was common for black families to live in small houses or quarters behind the main estates of white families, especially if they worked as domestic staff. Rachel searched employment records and found what she was looking for. The Wellingtons employed a woman named Martha Freeman as their cook from 1888 to 1899. The 1890 census listed Martha Freeman, age 35, Negro widow, living with her daughter Sarah Freeman, age 6. Sarah, the right age, the right initial. Rachel felt certain she'd found them. She researched further, finding pieces of both families' stories. Charles Wellington had died in 1897. Margaret and the daughters had moved to a smaller house in 1898, no longer able to maintain the large estate. Martha Freeman had continued working for the family until 1899, when the trail went cold. No further records of her employment in Atlanta. What had happened to Emma and Sarah? Had their friendship survived the forced separation that surely came when the family's circumstances changed? Rachel needed more information. She decided to look for descendants of both families. Finding Wellington descendants was relatively straightforward. The family had remained prominent in Atlanta society. But tracking Sarah Freeman proved more difficult. The name was common, and record-keeping for black families in the late 1800s was often incomplete or non-existent. After 2 weeks of exhaustive searching through marriage records, death certificates, and cemetery records, Rachel found a lead. Sarah Freeman had married Joseph Anderson in Atlanta in 1908. They'd had 4 children and moved to Philadelphia in 1912, part of the Great Migration. Sarah had died there in 1963. Through genealogy websites and social media, Rachel located living descendants. Sarah's great-granddaughter, Dr. Denise Anderson, was a retired professor living in Philadelphia. When Rachel called her and explained what she'd found, there was a long silence on the phone. "My great-grandmother Sarah rarely spoke about her childhood in Atlanta," Denise finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "But she told my grandmother once about a white girl she'd loved like a sister, a girl she'd had to leave behind. She said they'd shared everything, even a special doll. We always thought it was just a wistful story, maybe exaggerated or invented." "Are you telling me it was real?" While waiting for Denise to travel from Philadelphia to Atlanta, Rachel tracked down Emma Wellington's descendants. Emma had married in 1905, becoming Emma Sutherland. She'd had 3 children and lived in Atlanta until her death in 1958. Her grandson, Thomas Sutherland, now 75, lived in Decatur, just outside Atlanta. Rachel called Thomas and arranged to meet him at his home. He welcomed her into a house filled with family antiques and photographs. When Rachel showed him the photograph of the 2 girls with the doll, Thomas stared at it for a long moment, then walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner. "I need to show you something," he said quietly. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped carefully in yellowed tissue paper, was half of a porcelain doll. The head and left side of the torso, one arm part of the elaborate lace dress. The face was painted half white. Rachel's breath caught. "You have half the doll." "My grandmother kept it her entire life," Thomas said. "She told my father it was her most precious possession from her dearest friend. She never explained who the friend was or why the doll was cut in half. When she died, my father found this in her jewelry box with a note. For Sarah. She has the other half. Someday we'll put it back together." Thomas's eyes were wet. "I never knew who Sarah was. My grandmother wouldn't speak about her childhood much. She seemed sad about it, like she'd lost something precious. Now I understand. She lost her friend." Rachel gently removed the doll half from its wrapping and photographed it extensively. The craftsmanship was remarkable, expensive French porcelain, probably from the 1890s, but what moved her most was the evidence of the deliberate modification. Someone had carefully painted half the face brown, transforming it from a standard white doll into something unique and meaningful. "Who do you think modified the doll?" Rachel asked. Thomas considered. "My great-grandmother, Margaret, Emma's mother, was known in the family as someone who had unconventional views. According to family stories, she believed in education for everyone, including former slaves. She apparently caused scandal by teaching reading to her household staff. My father said there were whispers that she'd been involved in some kind of progressive religious movement before the Civil War. So she might have allowed, even encouraged, the friendship between Emma and Sarah," Rachel said. "More than that," Thomas replied. "She might have modified the doll herself. It would have been an extraordinary thing to do, give your white daughter a toy that represented racial equality. In 1895 Atlanta, that could have been dangerous." Rachel explained that Denise Anderson, Sarah's great-granddaughter, was coming to Atlanta. Thomas's face lit up. "She has the other half?" "I don't know yet," Rachel admitted. "But we're about to find out." Denise Anderson arrived in Atlanta on a Thursday morning. Rachel had arranged for her and Thomas Sutherland to meet at the museum, neutral ground for what promised to be an emotional encounter. When Denise walked into Rachel's office carrying a small vintage suitcase, Rachel's heart raced with anticipation. "I went through my great-grandmother's things that my mother kept," Denise said, her voice shaking slightly. "I found this." She opened the suitcase and removed a fabric-wrapped bundle. Inside was the right half of a porcelain doll head. Torso, arm, part of a lace dress. The face was painted half brown. Rachel and Thomas stared at it in wonder. When Thomas placed his grandmother's half next to Denise's great-grandmother's half, they fit perfectly. The doll was complete again after 129 years of separation. Both descendants were crying. Rachel found herself wiping tears as well. The symbolism was overwhelming. 2 halves of a deliberately modified doll, preserved separately by 2 friends forced apart by circumstance and segregation, each keeping their half as a reminder of a love that society said shouldn't exist. "They cut it in half when they knew they had to separate," Denise said softly. "So they'd each have something to remember." Thomas nodded. My grandmother kept it until she died at 73. That means she held on to this for over 60 years. She never forgot Sarah. Rachel had arranged for a photographer to document the reunion of the doll halves. As they positioned the pieces together, she asked both descendants to share what they knew of the friendship from family stories. Thomas went first. My father said grandmother Emma had been a sad woman, especially when she was older. She never talked much about her childhood, but once, when my father was a teenager, she told him she'd had a sister once not by blood but by choice. She said the sister had been taken away from her, and she'd spent her whole life regretting that she hadn't fought harder to keep their friendship. Denise's story complemented Thomas's. Great-grandma Sarah told my grandmother that she'd loved a white girl in Atlanta like they were twins. She said this girl's mother was kind, that she treated Sarah like her own daughter, teaching her to read and letting the girls play together. But when the girl's father died, everything changed. The family lost money, Sarah's mother lost her job, and they had to leave Atlanta. Great-grandma Sarah said she'd cried for months. She kept half a doll her whole life to remember. Did your great-grandmother say anything about the doll being modified? Rachel asked Denise. Yes, Denise exclaimed. She told my grandmother the girl's mother had painted the doll for them, half white and half brown so that each girl could see herself in it. She said it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done, acknowledging that both of them deserved to be seen and represented. With the identities of the girls confirmed and the doll reunited, Rachel focused on understanding Margaret Wellington, the woman who'd apparently facilitated this extraordinary friendship. She returned to archives, this time looking specifically for information about Margaret's life and beliefs. What she discovered was remarkable. Margaret Wellington, born Margaret Hayes in 1852, had grown up in a progressive Quaker family in Pennsylvania. She'd moved to Atlanta in 1878 to teach at a school for freed slaves, where she met Charles Wellington, whose family disapproved of her northern progressive views but who married her anyway in 1880. Rachel found letters Margaret had written to her sister in Pennsylvania, preserved in a collection at Swarthmore College's Friends Historical Library. In one letter from 1889, Margaret wrote, "Charles allows me my eccentricities, though his family finds me troublesome. I teach Martha's daughter Sarah alongside Emma. They are like sisters, and I will not have Sarah grow up believing herself inferior simply because society insists upon it. I am raising Emma to see the humanity in all people." Another letter from 1892 was even more explicit. Emma asked why Sarah cannot come to her birthday party with her school friends. I explained that the other families would not approve. Emma wept and said it was wrong. She is right, of course. It is monstrously wrong. I am determined that my daughters will not absorb the poison of racial hatred that surrounds us. Whatever small acts of defiance I can manage, I will. Then Rachel found the letter that explained the doll. Dated June 1895, Margaret wrote to her sister, "For the girl's birthday, Emma and Sarah share a birth month. I've done something that would scandalize all of Atlanta if it were known. I purchased an expensive French doll and modified it. I painted half its face to represent Sarah. The girls were delighted, each seeing themselves reflected. They play with it together in the back garden where prying eyes cannot see. I know this friendship cannot last, society will not permit it. But I am determined that both girls remember there was a time when they loved each other simply as friends, when race was not yet a barrier between them. That memory might sustain them through the hateful world they will inherit." Rachel sat back, moved by Margaret's words. This woman had understood exactly what she was doing, creating a memory of equality and friendship that could survive forced separation. The photograph had been part of that same impulse. Documentation that the friendship had existed. Proof that love could transcend the divisions society imposed. She shared the letters with Thomas and Denise. Both were deeply moved. "My great-great-grandmother was brave," Thomas said quietly. "She could have faced serious social consequences for this." In 1895 Atlanta, white women who crossed racial boundaries could be ostracized, even harmed. And she protected my great-great-grandmother Martha and great-grandmother Sarah by keeping the friendship mostly hidden. Denise added, "The garden, the privacy, she understood the danger they all faced." Rachel nodded. The photograph was probably taken by someone Margaret trusted. A traveling photographer maybe who wouldn't report what he'd seen. And then it was hidden, kept safe until the danger passed. Except the danger never really passed, did it? Not in Margaret's lifetime. Not in Emma's or Sarah's. The photograph stayed hidden until now. Rachel continued digging through records to understand what had happened after. 1895. The story that emerged was heartbreaking, but not surprising given the era's harsh realities. Charles Wellington died in 1897, leaving significant debts. The cotton trade had been volatile, and he'd made poor investments. Margaret was forced to sell the large Wellington estate and move with her daughters to a small rented house. She could no longer afford to employ household staff, including Martha Freeman. Martha and Sarah had to find new employment and housing. Records showed Martha worked briefly for 2 other families in Atlanta before leaving the city entirely in 1899. Rachel traced her to Augusta, Georgia, where she'd found work at a boarding house. The separation would have been traumatic for both girls. Emma was 12, Sarah was 11, old enough to understand they were losing each other, young enough to be powerless to prevent it. The doll being cut in half must have happened during those painful final days. Rachel found one more letter from Margaret to her sister, dated August 1897. The girls are devastated. Emma weeps every night for Sarah. I told her they might write to each other, but Martha has no fixed address yet. And in any case, correspondence between them could bring unwanted attention to both families. The girls said goodbye yesterday. They cut Emma's doll in half so each could keep a piece. I helped them do it, though it broke my heart. Emma said she will keep her half forever, so she never forgets Sarah. Sarah said the same. They are children, and they believe their promises will hold. I pray they are right. Thomas had brought more of Emma's belongings to the museum journals she'd kept as a teenager and young woman. Rachel read through them with Thomas's permission, finding scattered references to Sarah throughout the years. December 1899, I wonder where Sarah is tonight. Is she warm? Is she safe? Does she remember me as I remember her? June 1902. It is my birthday. I turned 17? Sarah should be 16 now. I still have her half of the doll. Mother says I am too old for such sentiments, but I cannot let it go. April 1905. I am to be married to William Sutherland. He is kind and will provide well. But I find myself thinking of Sarah and wondering if she is married, if she is happy. I wish she could be at my wedding. I wish we could have remained friends into adulthood. But the world does not allow such things. The last reference Rachel found was from 1935, when Emma was 50. Cleaning the attic today. Found Sarah's half of the doll wrapped in my old baby blanket. I am an old woman now with grandchildren, and yet seeing it brought back that fierce love I felt as a child. Sarah, wherever you are, I hope you had a good life. I hope you knew how much you mattered to me. Rachel proposed a special exhibition at the museum. Forbiddens. Friendship. Emma and Sarah, 1895. The centerpiece would be the original photograph, the reunited doll halves, Margaret's letters, and excerpts from Emma's journals. Thomas and Denise both enthusiastically agreed, wanting their ancestors' story told. The museum's board was more hesitant. Several members worried about the political implications of highlighting cross-racial friendship during the Jim Crow era, especially in a museum that had traditionally focused on preserving white Southern heritage. Rachel made her case at a board meeting with Patricia Washington's strong support. This story matters because it shows that even in the darkest periods of segregation and racial hatred, human connection was possible. Emma and Sarah were children who loved each other despite every social force working to prevent that love. Margaret Wellington was a white woman who actively resisted the racism of her time. These stories deserve to be preserved and celebrated, not hidden away as they have been for over a century. The board approved the exhibition, though not without dissent. Some members resigned in protest, calling it revisionist history and inappropriate politicization, but others, including several younger board members, championed the project enthusiastically. As Rachel prepared the exhibition, word spread through local and then national media. The photograph of the two girls with the modified doll resonated powerfully. News outlets ran stories about the doll that defied Jim Crow, and the friendship segregation couldn't erase. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people expressed interest in seeing the exhibition. Educators requested permission to use the materials in curricula. Other museums and historical societies reached out with similar stories. They'd discovered in their own collections evidence of other cross-racial friendships and acts of resistance that had been deliberately hidden or suppressed. But there was also backlash. Rachel received angry emails and phone calls accusing her of race baiting and destroying Southern heritage. Someone vandalized the museum's front entrance with spray paint. Online comments on news articles ranged from moved to hostile. Through it all, Rachel remained focused on the story itself. Two children who'd loved each other. The woman who'd protected that love and the evidence that had survived 129 years of silence. Thomas and Denise gave interviews together, presenting a united front as descendants of both sides of the friendship. Their obvious affection for each other and their shared commitment to honoring their ancestors provided a powerful counterpoint to critics. The exhibition opened in September 2024. Lines stretched around the block. People of all races stood together, viewing the photograph, reading Margaret's letters, and seeing the reunited doll. Many visitors wept. Parents brought children, using the story to talk about friendship, equality, and the importance of seeing beyond racial divisions. One element was missing from the exhibition that Rachel desperately wanted to include: the actual garden where Emma and Sarah had played and where the photograph had been taken. The Wellington estate had been demolished decades ago, replaced by a parking lot. Or so Rachel had thought. Dr. Palmer, the architecture professor, contacted her with surprising news. I was wrong about the property being destroyed. The house is gone, but a portion of the original garden was preserved as part of an adjacent property. It's been maintained by the current owners, though they didn't know its history. I spoke with them, and they're willing to let you see it. Rachel, Thomas, and Denise visited the property together on a warm October afternoon. Behind a contemporary house on what had once been the edge of the Wellington estate, they found it. A walled garden with the same brick and Burton ironwork visible in the photograph, now weathered but intact. The camellia bushes had grown massive over 129 years, but they were still there, still blooming. The three of them stood in that garden, in the exact spot where Emma and Sarah had sat for their photograph in 1895. Thomas held the museum's reproduction of the restored photograph. Denise had brought both halves of the doll, reunited and carefully preserved under glass. They sat right here, Thomas said softly. Playing together, sharing that doll, being friends in defiance of everything their world told them was proper. My great-grandmother carried the memory of this place her whole life, Denise added. She told my grandmother about the smell of the camellias, the feel of the brick wall warming in the sun, the sound of Emma's laugh. She said this garden was the safest, happiest place she'd known as a child. The property owners, moved by the story, agreed to restore the garden section to its 1890s appearance and allow it to be designated as a historic site, the Emma and Sarah Friendship Garden. A plaque would tell the story of the two girls and Margaret Wellington's courage. Rachel worked with landscape architects and historians to recreate the garden as closely as possible to its 1895 appearance. They used period photographs and garden design books to guide the restoration. The camellia bushes were pruned and cared for. A bench was installed in approximately the same spot where the girls had sat for their photograph. The garden dedication ceremony in December brought together descendants of all three families: Wellington, Freeman, and even some distant relatives of Martha Freeman. Media coverage was extensive. The garden became a pilgrimage site for people interested in civil rights history and stories of resistance to segregation. At the ceremony, Thomas and Denise spoke together. Our great-grandmothers were forced apart, Thomas said. They lived their lives separately, carrying the memory of this friendship but unable to restore it. But we stand here together, descendants of both sides, united by their story. The division that separated Emma and Sarah no longer separates us, Denise added. This garden represents hope that love and friendship can survive even the most oppressive systems, and hope that we can recover and honor the stories that were hidden. Emma and Sarah's friendship was forbidden in their time, but it is celebrated in ours. That is progress. That is justice. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Rachel stood in the museum's main gallery, watching visitors move slowly through the Emma and Sarah display. The photograph of the two girls with their modified doll had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and shared millions of times on social media. But what moved Rachel most wasn't the public attention. It was the personal connections the story had sparked. Dozens of people had come forward with similar stories from their own families, photographs that had been hidden, friendships that had been suppressed, evidence of cross-racial connection during the Jim Crow era that families had kept secret for generations. An elderly black woman from Birmingham brought a photograph of her grandmother playing with a white girl in the 1920s, both holding the same jump rope. "My grandmother never spoke about it," the woman explained. "But she kept this photo hidden in her Bible. I didn't understand until I saw Emma and Sarah's story." A white man from Charleston donated a modified doll similar to Emma and Sarah's, his grandmother's, apparently painted to represent her friendship with their family's black cook's daughter in the 1900s. "Our families kept it secret," he said. "We were ashamed. Now I understand we should have been proud." The museum created a new permanent installation, Hidden Friendships, Stories of Connection Across the Color Line. It grew constantly as more people came forward with evidence that human connection had persisted despite segregation's brutal attempts to prevent it. Thomas and Denise had become close friends, their families now intertwined across the racial divide that had separated their ancestors. Thomas's grandchildren played with Denise's grandchildren. They celebrated holidays together. "Emma and Sarah's friendship finally has its happy ending," Thomas told Rachel. "Not in their generation, but in ours." The doll itself, carefully restored and reassembled, sat in a climate-controlled display case in the museum, illuminated to show both halves equally. Visitors often stood before it in silence, moved by its simple testimony. A toy deliberately modified to represent two children, acknowledging that both deserve to see themselves reflected, both deserve to be valued equally. Rachel had written a book about the discovery and its aftermath. In the final chapter, she reflected on Margaret Wellington's courage and foresight. Margaret understood something profound. She knew Emma and Sarah's friendship couldn't last in the world of 1895 Atlanta. But she also knew that by documenting it through the photograph, through the modified doll, she could preserve evidence that such friendship was possible. She was creating testimony for a future she hoped would be more just. That future is ours. We have received her testimony. Now we must prove ourselves worthy of it. On a spring afternoon, much like the day in 1895 when the photograph was taken, Rachel returned to the Emma and Sarah Friendship Garden. School groups visited regularly now, and today a class of diverse 8-year-olds, the same age Emma and Sarah had been sat on the bench, learning their story. "They were best friends," the teacher explained. "Just like you have best friends." But people told them they couldn't be friends because one was white and one was black. That was wrong. Emma and Sarah knew it was wrong. And the grown-up who took care of them, Emma's mother Margaret, she knew it was wrong too. So they took this picture to remember their friendship even though they knew they'd have to separate. A little black girl raised her hand. "Did they ever see each other again?" "No," the teacher said gently. "They never did. But they remembered each other their whole lives. And now, because of this picture and the special doll they shared, we remember them too. We remember that friendship and love are stronger than hate." Rachel watched the children examine reproductions of the photograph, pointing at details, asking questions. One boy noticed the doll's divided face and asked why it looked like that. When the teacher explained that it had been painted to represent both girls equally, the children accepted it as natural and right, the way children do when presented with equality as the norm rather than the exception. This, Rachel thought, was why the story mattered. Not just as historical curiosity, but as evidence for new generations that the divisions adults create are not inevitable, not natural, not necessary. Emma and Sarah had known it in 1895. These children knew it now. It was the generations in between Rachel's, her parents, her grandparents who had forgotten and needed reminding. A museum visitor approached Rachel, recognizing her from news coverage. "Thank you for finding this story," the woman said. "My daughter and her best friend, one white, one black, saw the exhibition. My daughter said, 'This could have been us if we'd lived back then.' She cried thinking about being separated from her friend. It made history real for her in a way nothing else has." Rachel nodded, moved as she always was by such testimonies. The photograph had been hidden for 129 years. Waiting for someone to look closely enough at the doll between the two girls to see its true significance. That doll, half white, half brown, had been a radical declaration of equality and worth in 1895, and its message remained radical and necessary today. Emma and Sarah had been forced apart, but their story had survived. The love between two children had outlasted the hatred of the society that separated them. And now, finally, in a restored garden where camellias bloomed each spring, their friendship was remembered, honored, and celebrated, no longer forbidden, no longer hidden, but elevated as an example of the world that should have been, and the world that might yet become. The photograph's anonymous donor had been right to bring it to light. Some stories, no matter how long they've been buried, deserve to be told. Emma and Sarah's was one of them. And thanks to a modified doll visible in the corner of an old photograph, their testament to friendship across the color line would endure, teaching new generations that love has always been stronger than the laws designed to prevent it.